Hi everyone! Today we're going to have a look at the XParticles 4 circle packer, which is usually intended for packing round shapes like circles or spheres without those spheres or circles touching each other. So let's dive right in and use the circle packer to create squares that are not touching. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an XP system to my scene. And if I hit play, it's probably going to look a little bit different than your scene because I've changed the default settings of my XP system. For one thing, my emitter is only emitting 100 particles per frame, and also on the display tab I've set the particle color to white and saved that as a default. And on the object tab of the XP system I switched off icon in viewport. Next I'm going to go to the other objects here and I'm going to add an XP circle packer. And if I switch to my front view and hit play, nothing will change because the XP circle packer needs an emitter to work. We can either create one down here or we can drag an existing emitter into this slot here. Before I do, I'm going to change a few things on the emitter tab. On the object tab, I'm going to change the size to, let's do 530 maybe by 290, something that is rectangular. And if I hit H on my keyboard, it's going to frame that emitter. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so it covers the entire screen. So now the particles are created in this entire area here. If I go to my circle packer, I can now drag my emitter into the slot here. If I go back and hit play again, we're going to get a lot of circles and none of these are touching. Right now, that's not that obvious because for one thing, I only have a couple of particles. So let's go ahead and change that on the emission tab. I'll try 1000 for a start. Okay, so that's a little better. And if you zoom in, you can see that none of these circles are touching. Of course, I don't want circles. In this case, I want squares. So we'll have to change a few things. But first of all, I think I'm going to explain a couple of things about the circle packer. Down here in the attributes manager, you can see that we have some options here. One is for the display mode. Right now it displays filled circles. We can switch that to circles, spheres, or we can choose to display the particles according to what is set in the emitter. So if I change that to circles, we're getting this. If I change that to spheres, we're going to get spheres. And if I set this to as emitter, I need to go to the emitter too, and on the display tab I can change the editor display. Now as soon as I make a change in here, if I switch that to circles in the circle packer and if I go back to the emitter, it automatically updates the emitter with the same display option or with the same display setting. But if I choose as emitter, then go to my emitter, I can change the shape. Let's do a plane. And now what we get is a number of squares. If I render this, we're getting a black screen, and that's because we don't have an XParticles material. So let's go ahead and create one. If I go down to the material manager, I can go to create shader, XParticles material, and we need to drag this onto the emitter, not on the circle packer. That's not going to work. So now if I render, I get circles, because that's defined by the circle packer. The display is just the way you want to display your particles. It does not mean that XParticles will render these squares. So that's just the display mode. We can still use the display mode though to change some settings in the circle packer to try and get squares that are not overlapping. So let's go to the circle packer, and what we can do here is, for one thing, we can change the maximum and minimum radius, and we can get the maximum radius from this object, which is the circle packer, or we can choose to get the maximum radius from the emitter. For this tutorial, I'm going to keep it to this object here just to keep things simple. However, the radius won't do much in terms of changing the fact that these squares are overlapping. what we can do to get less overlapping or fewer overlapping squares is we can change the minimum separation. If I bring that up to 1 and hit play again, we should get fewer of those overlapping squares, and you can see that is working a little bit better, but we're still getting some in some places here. Of course, the number of overlapping squares that you get will very much depend on the radius that you set for your particles. So if I make that bigger, and also depending on the minimum separation, you will get more or fewer overlapping squares. So if I bring that up to 2, you can see we're getting a lot fewer squares that are overlapping. Like I said before, we cannot render these squares. If I hit render, we're still getting circles. So one thing we can do to change the render to display the squares is we can go to the generators and we can create sprites. And the sprite object also needs an emitter. I'm just going to drag our emitter in here. And once we do that, we get all of these options down here. And you can see that the sprite type by default is set to cube. I'm going to set that to plane. We don't really have an option that says plane, but we do have the placard option here, and that's exactly what we need. So now if I render this, I'm getting these squares. I want to fill this area up a little faster, so I'm going to go to my emitter, go to the emissions tab, and I'm going to set the emission or the birth rate to 10,000. And now that area is filling up a lot faster. And we're also getting a nice coverage here. If I go to my render settings and change the output to all frames, and let's go ahead and do a render of the first few frames. And let me just undo that. I'm also going to set my front view as the render view here. Now if I go back and hit play, you can see that the particles are displayed immediately and all at once, and I don't want that. So let's go ahead and change that, and we can do that by using an option on the scaling tab of the circle packer, and the option is scale the particles up. So I'm going to do that, and we can choose how many frames it takes for the particles to scale up, and we can add variation to that. For now, I'm going to set this, let's do maybe 35, and I'm going to do a variation of 100% because I want a very dense population of this rectangular shape here. So now let's see what happens when we hit play. And the problem is, as soon as we add this scaling option, we're getting a ton of overlapping squares again. And of course we could try and change the minimum separation of the circle packer. But the longer we play this, the more overlapping squares we get. So let's go ahead and bring down the radius and try that again. And it's working a little bit better, but sooner or later we're getting all of these overlapping squares. And here's the reason why we're getting these. If I change the display mode of the circle packer back to filled circles and hit play and then stop the animation, and if I zoom in, you can see why we're getting these overlapping squares. You can see that each of these circles fits right into that square shape of the particle, but the particle is surrounding that circular shape, and that means the corners can overlap. The circles themselves are not overlapping, but the actual particles are. So that means the sprites are not really an option here for me. In order to get the result that I want, I'm going to use actual geometry. So let's get rid of that sprite object here, which also created actual geometry, but we're going to do this with a plane object and a disk. So what I'm going to do is, let's just go back to frame 0. I'm going to add a plane, and I'm going to put this to -z. I'll change the segments to 1. We need to use as few polygons as possible because the scene will get a lot heavier. I'm going to hit NH to switch to wireframe mode, And the size of this plane actually doesn't really matter because the radius will eventually be defined by the circle packer in here. I'm going to scale this down just a little bit, maybe to 50%. And then I'm also going to add a disk. Let's go ahead and drag that plane into the generator object. Well, before I do, actually, I need to do something else. I need to go to the null object and I'm going to create an XP generator. And then I'm going to make that plane a child of the generator. Now let's see what happens if we do that. We're not getting the result that we want because the generator also needs an emitter. So let's go ahead and drag our emitter in there. Play again. And you can see we're getting pretty much the same result that we did with the sprites. And the reason again is because these circles, while they fit into each of these squares, the squares themselves are surrounding those circles and therefore the corners can overlap with the other objects. So we need to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to drag this plane out of the generator null object for now. And let's go back to frame 0 so we can see things. And what I'm going to do with this disk is I'm also going to switch it to -z. Let's get rid of all those disk segments. And I'm going to scale that disk up so it touches the corners of the square. And I'm getting rid of most of the geometry. We just need something that surrounds that plane. And we can go down to 8 rotation segments. You can see the disk is still touching the corners of the square. And then what I'm going to do is I'll make the plane a child of that disk, and I'll make the disk a child of the generator. So now if I hit play, we're getting something like this. And if I render this, I'm getting circles, and the reason is the disk is still visible. Let's switch that off for the renderer, and that means we need to switch the traffic light here for the plane to green, and we're still getting the same result because the emitter is still being rendered. So if I switch the emitter to invisible for the renderer, now I'm getting the squares. And the squares this time are not touching. And if you zoom in, and let's just switch that display to circles. And now you can see the disks are surrounding those squares, and the planes are inside of those disk objects. So if I let this play, the area will be filled with these objects, but none of these will be touching because the circle packer, as the name suggests, uses the circle radius, so it works best with circles and spheres. But now we have these circles around those squares, and that's why we're getting a result like this. Now let's go ahead and change a few things here. For one thing, I want to change the radius. Let's bring this up to 8 or 10. I'll make this a little bit bigger. And I'm also going to change the emission to something a lot higher. Let's bring this up to 20,000. And this should make sure that we get a lot more variation as far as the sizes of the objects are concerned. So this is looking a lot better, I think. But I'm still going to change that to, let's see, let's try 40,000. Now the scene will get a lot heavier, but we're also getting a lot more variation here. Let's check the settings of the circle packer. Here I want to change the minimum separation back to 0. We don't need that separation anymore. So now if I hit play, I should get a lot more variation here as far as the sizes are concerned. Of course, it takes a lot longer to calculate everything. You can see my viewport switches to a lower resolution because it's getting quite heavy now. And if I render this, I am now getting something like this, and that is exactly what I was after. So that's good. Now we probably need more time here, because I also want to scale all of those squares back down. And I don't want the animation to start right away. So I'm going to the emitter, to the emission tab, and I'm not going to emit all frames, but I'm going to start, let's say, at frame 5, and let's see how long it takes for this area to fill up. I'm just going to restart the entire simulation here. And this will take a bit. So I think I'm going to stop the emission at around frame 55. So let's change the end emit to 55, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to the circle packer, to the scaling tab, and I'm also going to switch on scale down. And in order to scale these particles down, we also have a couple of options here. The first one is we can delay the time before scaling down actually starts. And let's change this maybe to 35. You'll just have to play around with these settings here to get something that looks nice. We can add a bit of variation, and we can also change the scale down time. Let's try 35 for now, and let's give this a variation of 80%, and let's see what we get. I'm going to render this animation to the picture viewer, and I'm also going to change the timeline to maybe 180 frames, because we will need more time in order for all of these squares to disappear again. And I'm going to hit H on my keyboard, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that the entire viewport is covered by our squares here. So let's do something like this, and I'm going to hit render, and I'm going to speed up the video because this will take a bit. So the render is finished, and you can see that on the last frame we still have some particles that are visible. And I want this to be like the beginning of the animation where we have a black image here. So we need to change that. Let's just play through that animation and see how it looks. So I'm liking everything except the fact that we still have some particles that are visible at the end of the animation. And in order to change that, I'm going back to the settings of the circle packer. And there's a number of things we can do. We can change the display time to something that is shorter, or we can scale these down a little bit faster. Maybe bring the variation down. I'm going to keep the delay before scale time. And I'm going to do another render. And again, I'm going to speed up the video. So the render is finished, and unfortunately we still have some particles that are visible at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'll just make the animation a little bit longer and change that to 210 frames. And I'll do another render, and again I'm going to speed up the video. So here we go, the render is finished and all of the particles have disappeared. Let's just play through this animation to see how it looks. And I think this is looking pretty good, so I'm going to keep that. But there's still a few things I want to change. One of those things is the color. Right now everything's white, and I want this to be a little more colorful. So let's go to our emitter. We can use the XP material to put some color on our objects here. And on the display tab, I'm going to change the color mode from single color to gradient random. And we probably need to start the animation again to update the color. And this is what we're getting right now. Now you can pick any colors that you want. I've already prepared a gradient. I'm going to load that preset. It's this one. And you can see I've changed the interpolation to none here because I don't want any color transitions between the particles. I just want these 5 colors. And what we can also do is distribute the knots evenly. You can do that by right-clicking on the gradient and choose distribute knots. So now we have something like this. And that's looking fine, but the colors seem a little bit dark. I want these to be a little bit brighter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a light to the scene, and I'm going to move it in front of my emitter here. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to change that light from omni to an area light. And I'm going to make it about as big as the emitter, so it covers the entire area here, something like this. And let's do another quick render here. And it's even darker than before, so we can crank up the intensity, and that's looking a little better. Just don't go too high with the intensity, because at some point if I bring that up too high, it's going to blow out the colors here. I'll just undo that and go back to about 300 or 250. 250 looks fine. We can also try to switch off specular in the light and see what happens. And now we're getting something like this. Now this is much more colorful and I like that. So I'm going to keep this. Maybe we can bring the intensity up a little bit further. See what happens. I think I'll drag this up a little more to get something like this maybe. Okay, so that's pretty much it. The last thing I want to change is, let me just frame that scene, and I'm going to zoom in so I can cover the entire screen with the emitter, something like this. The last thing I want to change is the background, and I'm going to change it to a dark blue that matches the color of our particles here. So let's go ahead and create a new material. And I'm going to open this and switch off reflectance, and I'll change the color to some dark blue. Something that is almost black, and I'm going to change the model from Lambertian to Orenair. In this case it doesn't really do much. Usually it makes the material a little bit rougher and a little less reflective. And let's go ahead and create a background, and I'm going to put that color on the background, and let's do a render to see how that looks. And the color actually is still a little bit bright. We need some more contrast here, so I'm going to change that to something like this maybe, and that's looking good. So all that's left to do now is to go to the render settings, and for my final render I'm going to use a resolution of 1920 by 1080, which is full HD, and you can render the animation. Again, I'm going to speed up the video because this will take a bit, and I'll come back when the render is finished. So here we go, this is our finished animation, and this is what it looks like. It's a bit choppy because it takes a lot of computing power on my PC, so I'll just save this out as an animation. And this is what the animation looks like. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.